He stood in front of the mirror, the tuxedo hanging awkwardly on his lean frame, slightly faded stitched at the collar, and carrying the scent of time. Ezra Langston didn't choose this suit because it fit him well. He wore it because it was the only thing his father had left behind before vanishing from their lives without explanation. The tags were gone, the pockets empty, but the silence woven into its fabric spoke louder than any farewell letter. As the world outside celebrated youth and promises under glowing prom lights, Ezra wore his absence like a second, skin-tight, visible, unspoken. For most of his life, Ezra had been told his father abandoned them. His mother never offered details, only the bitter phrases children are meant to accept without question. He couldn't handle real life. He chose to disappear, and later he wasn't the kind of man a boy should grow up to become. Ezra stopped asking by the time he entered middle school, but it never stopped eating at him. The mystery, the unfinished sentence in his bloodline. Their home in Pasadena was modest, cluttered with hand-me-downs and boxed-up memories no one dared open. The attic remained off-limits, except during hurricanes of cleaning or rare moments of nostalgia. It was during one of those afternoons chasing a mouse his mother swore she saw that Ezra stumbled on the dusty trunk wedged behind brittle holiday decorations and a cracked crib. Inside the tuxedo lay folded next to a shoebox filled with old photographs, mostly black and white Polaroids of two men smiling against a beach backdrop, fingers intertwined. One of them was unmistakably Richard Langston, Ezra's father, young, shirtless, alive in a way Ezra had never imagined. Beneath the photographs were letters, dozens of them neatly bound in a silk ribbon dressed to T, each one signed with a different closing. Forever. Still waiting. Even if you forget me. He read them in the attic's dim light, heart pounding. They weren't dramatic declarations. They were simple, aching sentences about missing someone, about living quietly, about being erased from a life he once called his own. For the first time, Ezra saw the cracks in the story he'd been told. His father hadn't left because he was weak. He left because he was no longer allowed to exist in the version of the family his mother wanted. Ezra didn't come out to his mother that night. He didn't say anything. But when prom week arrived and his classmates bragged about limos and custom suits, he quietly retrieved the tuxedo from the attic and had it dry cleaned with his own savings. He didn't care if it was out of style. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't even sure what he was doing until the moment he buttoned the collar and stared at himself again in the mirror. All he knew was this someone once lived in this suit who was told he didn't belong. Someone who still wrote letters long after silence had answered back, and Ezra, awkward, observant, tired of being invisible, was going to wear that man's memory, like armor. He didn't take pictures that night. He didn't post on Instagram. He walked into the prom alone, shoulders back, eyes scanning the crowd. He wasn't there to dance. He was there to remember, to make sure one forgotten man didn't stay forgotten. If this story moved you, follow Heart Stories for more stories of truth, resilience, and rediscovery. You never know whose silence holds the next untold chapter. Ezra didn't expect anything to happen that night. He wasn't waiting for a revelation or applause. He had come to wear the truth on his body quietly for no one but himself. But life has a strange way of revealing its secrets when you stop chasing them. As students posed for photos and couples swayed under paper lanterns, Ezra stood near the back, close to the exit, watching shadows flicker across the gym floor. That's when he saw him. A man in his early 50s stood near the chaperone table holding a folded program scanning the crowd with a mixture of nostalgia and distance. He didn't belong there, at least not in the way the students did. He wore a black shirt tucked neatly into dark jeans, his hair salt and pepper, and swept back with intention. Something about him, his posture, his quiet stillness, reminded Ezra of the man in the Polaroids. He looked again and the man looked back. They didn't speak at first. The man tilted his head, eyes narrowing as if recognizing something deeper than a face. Then without warning, he began to walk toward Ezra. 1,000 thoughts raced through Ezra's mind, but his body stayed still. "You're Richard's boy, aren't you?" the man asked, voice calm but heavy. Ezra blinked. "How do you know that name?" The man smiled gently. "I'd recognize those eyes anywhere." His name was Thomas, and he was more than a family friend. He had once been Richard's partner. The kind people didn't speak about at the dinner table, the kind erased from stories. He hadn't seen Richard in decades, but he'd kept the letters, 2 copies of the same ones Ezra had found. And tonight he was here because his niece Mia was a senior, She'd insisted he come chaperone. Just for fun, she'd said. He almost hadn't. When Thomas saw Ezra from across the room wearing the tuxedo, that tuxedo, he froze. I bought that tux with Richard, he said. It was for our first and only anniversary. We were going to go dancing in San Francisco, but his father found out before we left. Everything unraveled after that. Ezra's throat tightened. He didn't abandon us, did he? Thomas looked down, then back up. No. He was pushed out. Your mother gave him an ultimatum, leave quietly or face ruin. His name was removed from everything. He fought. But back then, no one fought for men like us. Ezra listened every word, bending the framework of the past he thought he understood. He wasn't angry, at least not yet. He was grieving something he never had, a father who tried a history rewritten to protect someone else's pride. Thomas continued slower now. He stayed with me for a while after. But grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it just makes you vanish. One day he packed a bag and left. No goodbye, just a note that said, "Don't wait for me." I looked for him for years, but nothing. It was like he dissolved into silence. Ezra felt his legs give slightly, but he stayed upright. There was no scene, no dramatic moment, just two people standing in a school gym while synth pop played in the background and teenagers posted selfies. "Do you think he's alive?" Ezra asked. "I don't know," Thomas whispered. "But if he is, I know he'd want to know you looked for him, that someone still wore his name." They sat outside on a bench under a flickering lamppost talking. Until the prom ended, Thomas didn't try to fill in every gap. He didn't offer false hope, but he gave Ezra something rarer, a starting point, a list of places Richard had been seen, an old P.O. box in San Diego, a volunteer center in Oakland, a rehab program in Sacramento, none recent, all uncertain, but they were more than Ezra had ever had. When he got home that night, Ezra stood in front of the mirror again. He touched the lapel of the tuxedo gently like one might touch the edge of a photograph. This wasn't just an outfit anymore. It was evidence, a thread connecting a boy who never got to know his father and a man who never got to see his son grow up. For years, Ezra had believed he was forgotten, that his silence was a shield, but now he understood. Sometimes silence is a scream waiting to be answered, and he was ready to listen. Ezra waited 3 days before opening the envelope Thomas had slipped into his hand that night. It wasn't sealed, just folded neatly, yellowed at the creases like something often handled, but rarely shared. Inside were names of places, none of them recent, none promising, but all possible footprints of a man who once mattered. He ran his fingers across the addresses: a church shelter in Oakland, a rehab program in Sacramento, a transitional housing center in San Diego. They weren't destinations. They were fragments of a life no one ever taught him to grieve. He didn't tell his mother he was leaving. She wouldn't have stopped him, but she wouldn't have understood either. Ezra booked a bus to Oakland first, stuffing his backpack with a notebook, the shoebox of letters, and the tuxedo. Not because he planned to wear it again, but because it had become something like a compass, wrinkled, worn, but always pointing toward what had been lost. The church shelter was quiet, its windows boarded halfway from a recent storm. A volunteer named Ava told him she'd worked there 10 years and had never heard of a Richard Langston. But when he showed her the photo, his favorite one with Richard and Thomas smiling on a beach, she paused. "He looks like someone we used to see around." Went by Rick, quiet, never caused trouble, had a limp. She pointed toward the archives, a metal drawer of intake forms and notes scribbled by rotating staff. Ezra combed through them, heart thudding. One entry from nearly 15 years ago read, "Rick L. No ID talks, little asks about a place near the ocean." Ezra wrote it down. He didn't cry. Not there. The next stop was Sacramento, a smaller city but colder in tone. The rehab center had closed during the pandemic. He walked past its boarded doors anyway, half hoping for a ghost. Across the street stood a diner, and he went inside mostly for warmth. The waitress, older and worn, noticed the photo resting by his wallet. "I served him," she said. A quiet man, always sat at the corner booth, ordered black coffee and oatmeal, used to write letters. No one ever came for him. She didn't know where he went. Just that one day the letter stopped. The booth stayed empty. Ezra took a bus to San Diego next. The ocean was always part of the story, the waves crashing the dream Richard once had of living by the shore. The shelter there was full. Ezra waited 3 hours just to ask a question no one could fully answer. Did someone named Richard Langston ever live here? The director, a man named Carlos, didn't know, But one of the staff brought out a Polaroid from a forgotten bulletin board, a grainy shot of a group gathered during a Christmas meal, all wrapped in thrifted scarves and paper crowns. And there, almost out of frame, was a man with tired eyes and a barely there smile. Ezra took a photo of the photo. "That's him," he whispered. Not to anyone, just to the air. Carlos hesitated. He left a while back, didn't leave contact, but he wrote something on the shelter's wall before he left. It's still there. They walked to the back hallway where names and dates filled every inch like a timeline of invisible lives. Near the corner, faded under layers of marker and time, were the words, "If Ezra ever finds this, don't look for me, live." It was signed with a shaky R. Ezra stared at it, unable to move. He traced the letters slowly, each one feeling like a wound reopening. The message wasn't cruel, it wasn't abandonment. It was love, twisted through shame, expressed in absence. For so many years, Ezra had longed to hear his father say something. Anything. Now that he didn't know what to do with it. He checked into a cheap motel near the harbor and laid the letters out on the bed like constellations. The story was scattered, but it was real. A man who tried, a man who feared, a man who loved and lost and faded. That night, Ezra walked along the beach, the cold air stinging his skin, the moon throwing silver light across the water. He spoke into the waves. "You don't have to be found, but I needed to look." When he returned to his room, there was a voicemail from Thomas. "I've been thinking." It said, "If you're willing, maybe we can tell your story so others like him don't disappear." Ezra didn't answer right away. He just looked out the window toward the ocean, the salt heavy in the air, and whispered, "I'm not ready to stop walking." Ezra didn't plan to return. Not so soon, not while the salt from San Diego was still clinging to his hair, and the scent of old letters followed him like a shadow. But the call came 2 days after he'd traced his father's handwriting on a shelter wall. The voice on the other end, brittle as if it had swallowed years of silence and could no longer hold its weight. It was his mother. "I found something in the attic," she said. "It's yours, I think." He didn't ask what, just said he'd be home by the weekend. The house looked smaller than he remembered. The garden had overgrown ivy, curling over the porch rails like fingers trying to pull something back. His mother met him at the door, older than before, her face drawn not by time but by resistance of holding in too much for too long. She handed him a photo album, one he'd never seen. Inside were pictures of Richard holding Ezra as a baby, Richard smiling at a school play, Richard holding a sign that read, "My son is my whole world," in shaky handwriting. The last page had a newspaper clipping. "Local teacher dismissed amid allegations." No details, just a name. And the year Ezra was 6, I kept it locked away. She said, her voice barely audible. "I was ashamed, not of him, of what people would say, of how they'd treat you, of how it would change the way you saw yourselves." Ezra didn't look up. "You told me he left because he was weak." Her hands shook. "I know." He flipped through the photos, fingers tracing the spine of a past that had been denied to him. "He loved me," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. He finally had evidence to claim. "I never doubted that," she whispered. "But I didn't know how to let you know it was okay to love him back." The weight of that sentence hung between them, decades late, but necessary. Ezra didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just sat at the kitchen table in the same seat he used to color in homework, while pretending not to notice the silence when his father's name was brought up on accident. "You could have told me." He said, "I could have done a lot of things," she replied. "But I was raised in a house where silence was love, where the only way to protect your child was to keep them from the truth." Ezra looked at her. Not the woman who'd erased a man, but the woman who had been left behind by her own fear. He saw the cost of that silence etched in her posture, her expression, her inability to meet his gaze for more than a second. This wasn't about blame anymore. It was about endings, or maybe beginnings. "I'm not staying," he said. "I've found something I need to build." She nodded, not in agreement, but in acceptance. "Where?" "By the ocean," he answered. Somewhere he might have once dreamed of. The next week, Ezra took what little savings he had and put it into a down payment for a modest strip of land near the Pacific. Nothing grand. Just a worn-down cottage with a broken fence and a view of the sea. He named it Langston House, not for legacy, but for healing. Not a shelter, not a home, something in between. A place for men and women who, like his father, had disappeared beneath society's expectations and re-emerged as ghosts in their own stories. He sent letters to LGBTQ+ centers across California, offering Langston House as a resting point for anyone over 50 with nowhere else to go. "Come as you are," he wrote, no ID required, no questions asked. Within a month, the first guest arrived, then another, then three more, each with a name and a story and a silence they were trying to outlive. Ezra didn't expect to find Richard, but he began to feel him in other ways. In the way someone folded a towel just right, in the sound of waves hitting the porch at dawn, in the soft thank you whispered by a man who hadn't said his real name in years. The house began to breathe, and with each breath, Ezra found pieces of his father, not in form, but in spirit. He built a bench facing west where the sun melted into the sea. And every evening, he sat there alone, or with whoever needed company, letting silence speak for itself. On the first anniversary of Langston House, a letter arrived, no return address, no name, just one line. "You gave me back a name I thought I'd lost. Thank you, Ezra." The handwriting matched the wall in San Diego. He folded the letter, placed it inside the tuxedo's inner pocket, and hung it on the wall of the house framed under glass. A symbol, a promise. He didn't need Richard to walk through the door to know he'd come home. Langston House grew not in size, but in soul. Word spread quietly through shelters, community centers, whispered between aging voices who'd long given up on being seen. Ezra became something he never planned to be, a keeper of untold histories. He learned to brew strong coffee at dawn, to listen without interruption, and to recognize that healing often came not in answers, but in the permission to exist. One evening, just after sunset, a boy about 16 showed up at the gate. He said little, just clutched a backpack and asked, "Is this the place for people like him?" He pointed toward the plaque near the door which read Langston House, in memory of those made invisible. Ezra nodded. The boy looked over his shoulder, then stepped inside. His name was Micah. His grandfather had come out late in life only to be institutionalized by his own children. Micah had found one of his journals hidden in the lining of a winter coat. The entry spoke of a place by the ocean, where kindness lived in silence. Micah ran away to find it. He didn't know how, but somehow he did. Ezra let him stay the night, then another. He didn't ask questions. He only left a note by Micah's bed. "You belong here, but when you're ready to go back, I'll help you get there safely." Micah stayed 2 weeks. He helped paint the fence. He read aloud to a blind guest named Ellis. Before leaving, he placed a seashell on the bench by the water and said, "For your dad, I hope he's watching." Ezra smiled. "I think he is, in ways that matter." Weeks passed, the house carried on. Then one Sunday morning, a letter arrived in a familiar hand. The same careful curves, the deliberate spacing, inside a single key and a postcard with an address scribbled on the back. "No message, just you once wore my tuxedo. Maybe now you can sit in my chair." The address led Ezra to a care home outside Santa Barbara. He went heart steady, not hopeful, just open. He asked for Richard Langston. The nurse pointed down the hallway, her face softening. "He's quiet, doesn't speak much, but he always faces the sea." Ezra found him by the window, thin, fragile, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't look up at first, but when he did, the years dissolved, no introduction needed. "I wasn't sure you were real," Richard said, voice barely above a whisper. Ezra pulled out the letter he'd kept in the tuxedo pocket and laid it on the table between them. "I wore your tux," he said. "I looked for you. Not because I needed you to explain, but because I needed to remember I came from love." Richard's eyes brimmed. "I wanted to come sooner, but shame, it doesn't let go easy." Ezra shook his head gently. "You came when you could." They sat there for hours saying very little, just letting time fill the spaces that silence once claimed. Before leaving, Ezra reached into his bag and handed Richard a photo of the bench at Langston House with the ocean just behind it. "This seat is waiting for you," he said. "You don't have to stay invisible anymore." A month later, Richard moved in. He never asked to lead or be introduced as Ezra's father. But every evening he sat on the bench beside his son, watching the waves curl and break, just as they always had. And one night, when the sun slipped beneath the horizon like a secret finally told, Richard reached over, squeezed Ezra's hand, and whispered, "Thank you for looking for the version of me that I couldn't." Ezra didn't reply. He just held on, because some love doesn't need words, only witness. How many people in your life are waiting to be seen again? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, Subscribe to Heart Stories for more journeys of remembrance, reconciliation, and the quiet courage to return.